The fluorescent lights of the Ohio gas station store flickered overhead as I stuffed the last handful of 20s into my pocket. My hands trembled slightly, not from guilt. I'd long since stopped feeling that, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with another hasty departure. The security camera's red light blinked lazily in the corner, recording nothing but selective fragments of my final shift. I'd learned early on how to work around their blind spots. "Laura, we need to talk about the discrepancies in your drawer," Mike had said earlier that evening, his weathered face creased with disappointment as he waved the audit report. The paper trembled in his grip, much like my hands were doing now. I'd gotten sloppy, taken too much at once. Amateur mistake. $300 in a single night was pushing it, even for a place as poorly managed as this. The evening air bit at my skin as I hurried to my beaten-up Honda Civic, parked in the darkest corner of the lot. Columbus had been good to me. 6 months was longer than I usually stayed anywhere, but like every other stop along my endless journey, it had run its course. The trunk creaked in protest as I loaded the last of my belongings: 2 duffel bags of clothes, a laptop, and a shoebox containing various IDs with different names, but all bearing my face. The essentials of a modern nomad. I headed west on Interstate 70, watching the Ohio countryside blur past my window. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., its dim green numbers a countdown to another fresh start. Streetlights strobed across my face in rhythmic patterns, each flash illuminating another town I could never return to. Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville. The list grew longer with each passing year, like notches on a prison wall. The radio crackled with late-night talk shows and static as I drove, the voices of insomniacs and truckers filling my car with their lonely chatter. I kept the volume low, just enough to drown out the other sounds, the ones that had been following me for 3 years now, the whispers that came in the quiet moments when my guard was down and my thoughts drifted back to that night. Money got tight around Dayton. The gas gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and the few hundred I'd managed to steal from Mike's register wouldn't last long. That's when I saw it, a Speedway gas station rising out of the darkness like a fluorescent oasis. The "Help Wanted" sign in the window buzzed with promise, its neon light casting a sickly glow across the empty parking lot. The manager, Greg, barely glanced up from his phone as I filled out the application. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, writing down references I'd perfected over years of similar forms in similar places. The lies came easily now, each one a small brick in the wall I built between myself and my past. "Night shift okay?" he asked, thumb still scrolling through whatever had captured his attention. His disinterest was perfect, exactly what I looked for in a manager. "Keep the coffee fresh. Don't piss off the truckers. Start tonight." I nodded, already calculating how long it would take to learn the register's quirks, the camera's blind spots, the manager's patterns. 6 months tops, I thought. Build up enough cash to make it to the coast, maybe try my luck in California. New name, new story, same old schemes. But as I watched Greg shuffle back to his office, something felt different. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an unfamiliar frequency, and for a moment, just a moment, I swore I saw my shadow move independently of my body, stretching toward the back room where an old receipt printer sat gathering dust. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that some places choose you, that some debts can never be outrun. I didn't know about the printer, or the rules, or how everything I'd been running from was about to catch up with me in ways I could never have imagined. The Speedway existed in a void between places, a concrete island surrounded by fields that seemed to swallow all sound. During daylight hours, it was just another pit stop on an endless highway. But as darkness crept in and the moon hung low over the cornfields, the station transformed into something else entirely. The windows became mirrors, reflecting the harsh interior lights and creating the unsettling illusion that you were being watched by a perfect copy of yourself moving just slightly out of sync. The linoleum floor trapped decades of footsteps beneath its yellowed surface, each scuff mark telling the story of another traveler passing through. Sometimes, if I stared too long at the patterns, they seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. My first few shifts passed in a haze of routine tasks and careful observation. I learned quickly that the security camera above Register 3 had a 3-second delay, perfect for pocketing small bills without detection. The safe in Greg's office hadn't been changed since the 90s, its combination worn faintly into the dial from years of use. All the familiar signs of an easy mark. The parade of night owls and truckers provided cover for my subtle manipulations of the cash drawer. A 20 here, a 50 there. Small enough amounts that would blend into the background noise of daily transactions. I kept a mental ledger, tracking my takes with the precision of an accountant. It was almost too easy. The back room became my sanctuary during the dead hours between 3 and 4 a.m. It was a cramped space that reeked of industrial cleaner and stale cigarettes, illuminated by a single bulb that cast more shadows than light. Boxes of inventory created a maze of cardboard corridors, their contents spilling out like mechanical innards. And in the corner, half buried under old invoices and faded warning signs, sat the printer. It was an ancient thing, its once white plastic stained yellow with age, like old bones left in the sun. The brand name had worn away, leaving only ghostly impressions of letters that sometimes seemed to spell different words depending on how the light hit them. Greg had mentioned it offhandedly during my training, a backup for when the main register printer failed. But something about the way he said it, how his eyes never quite looked at the machine directly, should have warned me. The first sign that something was wrong came during my 4th night. The store was empty, the only sound the gentle hum of refrigerators and my fingers tapping against my phone screen. The fluorescent lights overhead had settled into their usual rhythm, a soft buzz that had become almost comforting in its consistency. Then the printer started. The sound cut through the silence like a scream, mechanical and wrong in ways I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the normal whir of receipt paper feeding through rollers. This was deeper, more organic, like something breathing through machinery. The noise echoed through the empty aisles, bouncing off glass refrigerator doors and creating a disorienting chorus of mechanical whispers. My feet moved toward the back room before my brain could process what was happening. The door felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself had thickened. The printer's display was dark, dead as it had been since my first day. But paper was spilling from its mouth onto the dusty floor, twisting and writhing like something alive. The paper had tangled around itself, forming patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. As I reached down to clear what I assumed was a simple paper jam, my fingers brushed against the receipt. It was warm. Not the warmth of machinery, but the heat of something freshly alive. What I read on that paper would change everything, but looking back now, I realized the printer wasn't revealing the rules to me. It was revealing me to something else, something that had been waiting for someone like me. Someone running from debts that couldn't be paid in stolen cash and false names. Time moved strangely in the back room as I stared at the twisted stream of paper flowing from the printer. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and carried a metallic taste that coated my tongue. Each breath seemed to require more effort than the last, as if the oxygen itself was being slowly replaced by something else. The paper was warm in my hands as I began untangling it, the texture wrong in subtle ways, too smooth in some places, slightly rough in others, like skin that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The fluorescent light above flickered erratically, each flash revealing different shadows that didn't quite match the objects casting them. At first, the text appeared faint, like words written in lemon juice waiting to be revealed by heat. But as I watched, they began to darken and sharpen, bleeding into existence as if the paper itself was birthing them. The printer's hum had changed pitch, becoming something that resonated in my teeth and made my vision blur at the edges. Rules for night shift employees. The words appeared in perfect black type, too crisp and clear for a printer this old. Rule 1. The first rule materialized slowly. If the printer starts printing on its own, do not read the receipt. Tear it off and burn it immediately. Rule 2. My fingers twitched, suddenly aware of the weight of my lighter in my pocket. I was already breaking the first rule. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't stop reading as more text appeared. Rule 3. Do not accept payment if the customer is wearing sunglasses after midnight. Politely tell them the station is closed. Rule 4. The next rule emerged like ink spreading through water. If the clock on the register skips a minute, unplug the printer and wait for the power to reset. Do not look at the clock until it restarts. Rule 5. Each new line brought with it a drop in temperature. I could see my breath now, forming patterns in the air that didn't dissipate quite right. Rule 6. Always leave an unopened bottle of water on the counter before your shift ends. Rule 7. The final rule appeared all at once, the letters seeming to burn themselves into the paper. If a receipt prints with your name on it, leave the station immediately. Do not look back. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow and fake in the cramped space. The sound seemed to bounce off the walls wrong, returning to my ears distorted and stretched. This had to be some elaborate prank, probably Greg's idea of breaking in the new girl. But as I stood there, clutching that impossible receipt, the printer's hum shifted again, dropping to a frequency that made my bones ache. The sound reminded me of something, a memory I'd been running from for 3 years. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and underneath it all, a similar mechanical hum that I'd heard just before everything went wrong. I shoved the paper into my pocket, trying to ignore how it seemed to pulse against my leg like a second heartbeat. The rules were ridiculous, nonsensical. I'd worked enough night shifts to know that strange things happened after midnight, but they always had logical explanations. Always. But as I walked back to the counter, something made me pause in the doorway. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, long enough for true darkness to flood the store. In that moment, I caught my reflection in the window. Except it wasn't just my reflection. Something else stood behind me, its shape almost human, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. When the lights came back on, I was alone again. That's when I noticed the register's clock. It was stuck between minutes, the digits frozen in an impossible configuration, and in the distance, I heard the printer start to hum again. The night pressed against the gas station windows like a living thing, a darkness deeper than usual that seemed to swallow the light from the parking lot lamps. I'd been at the register for hours, my fingers dancing across bills and coins with practiced precision as I worked my usual schemes. Each transaction provided cover for small adjustments to the day's totals, a skill I'd perfected over years of similar jobs. The receipt paper burned against my thigh, still tucked in my pocket where I'd hastily shoved it hours ago. 11:45 p.m. glowed on the register's display in sickly green digits. The numbers seemed to pulse slightly, though I told myself it was just eye strain from the harsh fluorescent lighting. I'd tried to dispose of the rules twice already. The first time, the trash can had somehow moved, just as I went to drop it in, sliding 3 inches to the left without a sound. The second time, The paper had grown so hot it nearly blistered my fingers. Now it sat in my pocket like a guilty secret, radiating warmth through the fabric of my jeans. The printer had maintained its silence for days, almost making me forget about those bizarre rules. Almost. But you don't survive as long as I have by ignoring warnings, no matter how strange they seem. When you live life on the edge of legitimacy, paranoia isn't paranoia, it's survival. At precisely 11:47 p.m., the quiet of the store was shattered by the sound of the old printer roaring to life. The noise was different this time, deeper, more purposeful. It reminded me of the sound a dog makes just before it attacks, that low growl that vibrates in your chest and triggers something primitive in your brain that screams, "Run." Paper spilled onto the floor in a pale spiral, writhing like something newly born. The first rule echoed in my mind. Do not read the receipt. Tear it off and burn it immediately. My hand moved to my pocket, fingers brushing against the lighter I always carried, a habit left over from when I still smoked, before that night 3 years ago when smoke and gasoline had mixed with devastating results. The rational part of my brain knew this was ridiculous. It was just a malfunctioning printer in a rundown gas station, spitting out gibberish in the middle of the night. I'd seen plenty of broken equipment in my various jobs, used plenty of convenient malfunctions to cover my tracks. This was different, though. The paper seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as I approached it. My fingers trembled as I picked up the receipt, the paper warm and slightly damp, like fevered skin. The text appeared in perfect clarity, each letter so crisp it seemed to float above the paper. 12:03 a.m., Laura. 2 gallons of gasoline, pump 6 inches. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The station clock still read 11:48 p.m. I crumpled the receipt and threw it toward the trash, but it never reached the bin. Instead, it hung in the air for a fraction of a second before falling to the floor, unfolding itself as it landed. The text had changed. She still remembers the smell of burning gasoline, Laura. The fluorescent lights overhead began to buzz louder, their hum synchronizing with the printer's distant whir. The sound built into a harmony that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Through the windows, I saw a car pull into the parking lot, a beaten-up Civic, identical to the one I'd been driving 3 years ago on that rainy night. Even the dent in the passenger door matched. The clock on the register clicked over to 12:02 a.m. The car's driver's side door opened slowly, revealing a figure that moved with jerky, unnatural motions. As they stepped into the fluorescent glow of the station's lights, my heart nearly stopped. They wore mirrored sunglasses that reflected impossible things: flames, twisted metal, and a face I'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The printer whirred again, louder this time, like it was laughing. 12:03 a.m., 2 gallons, pump 6. The past had finally caught up with me, wearing sunglasses after midnight. Time stretched like melted plastic as the figure stood motionless by their car. The sunglasses reflected the station's fluorescent glare, creating miniature galaxies of light that swirled and twisted in impossible ways. December wind whipped through the empty parking lot, but their clothes didn't move. Not even a wrinkle, not even a breath. Rule 2 hammered in my head like a migraine. Do not accept payment if the customer is wearing sunglasses after midnight. Such a simple rule, such a specific warning. Now I understood why. Their shadow stretched across the cracked asphalt, but something was wrong with it. While the figure remained statue still, their shadow writhed and twisted, its edges blurring and reshaping themselves into forms that hurt my eyes to look at. Sometimes it looked like flames, sometimes like twisted metal, sometimes like a body being pulled from a wreck. I dealt with my share of strange customers during countless night shifts across the country. The meth addicts with their paranoid ramblings, the drunks who couldn't quite remember how they got there, the ones running from things worse than what I was running from. But this was different. Every movement they made was too precise, too calculated, like someone who had studied human behavior but never quite mastered it. Like a puppet being operated by strings I couldn't see. When they finally moved toward the door, their feet never seemed to quite touch the ground. The bell above the door, that annoying tinny thing that had chimed every time someone entered for the past week, remained silent. On the security monitor, their image appeared as a smear of static, a human-shaped hole in reality. The air grew thick and cold as they approached the counter. That metallic taste from the back room filled my mouth again, mixed with something else. The acrid smell of gasoline and burning rubber. The same smell that had filled my lungs 3 years ago as I crawled from the wreckage, leaving. "Keep the change," they said, sliding a 20 across the counter. Their voice was wrong, layers of sound that didn't quite sync up, like multiple people speaking almost, but not quite in unison. Behind those mirrored lenses, I caught glimpses of things that might have been eyes, but weren't. Couldn't be. Because eyes don't move like that, don't fragment and reform like kaleidoscope patterns. I shouldn't have taken the money. The rule had been clear. But years of instinct, years of taking whatever I could get, made my hand reach out. The bill felt wrong against my skin, too warm, like the receipt had been, like flesh. As they turned to leave, they paused. Their head rotated too far, too smoothly, bones and muscles moving in ways human anatomy shouldn't allow. "She misses you, Laura." The words froze my blood. 3 years of running, of changing names and cities, of trying to forget. Nobody here knew about her. Nobody knew about that night, about the argument, about my decision to drive after those last 2 shots. "Who are you?" The question scraped out of my throat like broken glass. They smiled, and their teeth were all wrong. Too many, too sharp, arranged in patterns that suggested a geometry that shouldn't exist in our universe. "Check the printer," they said, their voice now a symphony of discordant whispers. Then they walked out into the darkness, each step leaving brief impressions of char on the linoleum. I looked down at the 20 in my hand. It had crumbled to ash, leaving behind the faint smell of burning flesh and a small scrap of paper with familiar handwriting. "Why did you leave me there, Laura?" The words were written in Sarah's handwriting. The same handwriting I'd last seen on the note she'd left on my windshield, hours before our final drive. The register clock read 2:13 a.m. when reality started to unravel. I'd been avoiding looking at it since the incident with the midnight visitor, keeping my eyes fixed on the scratched counter surface, the dusty shelves, anywhere but those sickly green digits. But time has a way of demanding attention, especially during the graveyard shift when minutes stretch like taffy. The fluorescent light above Register 3 had been flickering more than usual. Not the normal, steady pulse of dying bulbs, but an arrhythmic stutter that seemed to follow my heartbeat. Or maybe my heartbeat was following it. The distinction had started to blur, much like everything else in this place. The printer had been quiet since the ash money incident, but its presence felt heavier somehow. The silence from the back room had a weight to it, like something gathering strength, waiting. The air had grown thick with the smell of ozone and hot plastic, making each breath feel like inhaling static. I blinked, just once, a fraction of a second. The clock changed from 2:13 to 2:15 a.m. 1 minute gone, vanished like smoke, like the $20 bill, like Sarah on that rainy night. Rule 3 echoed in my mind with crystal clarity. If the clock skips a minute, Unplug the printer and wait for the power to reset. Do not look at the clock until it restarts. My hands trembled as I turned toward the back room. The printer's hum had transformed into something else entirely, a sound that made my molars ache and my vision swim. It reminded me of the noise a car's engine makes just before it dies, that last desperate wheeze before everything goes silent. The cord felt warm under my fingers, almost alive, like gripping a snake. As I pulled it from the wall, darkness swept through the store like a flood. The emergency lights, which should have kicked in automatically, remained dead. The darkness was absolute, the kind that makes you question if your eyes are even open. In that perfect blackness, I heard footsteps in the back room. Not the hurried steps of someone trying to rob the place. I'd heard those before, knew how to handle them. These were slow, deliberate, each step accompanied by a wet sound like something peeling itself off a floor. They moved with a precision that suggested whoever, whatever, was making them had all the time in the world. "Hello?" I called out, my voice small and wrong in the thick darkness. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. Then something clicked, a mechanical sound that wasn't quite mechanical enough. The printer's display flickered to life, casting a sickly glow that illuminated nothing but itself. Numbers that weren't numbers scrolled across its screen, forming patterns that hurt to look at. A receipt emerged, the text glowing with its own pale light. 2:17 a.m. Someone is behind you. I felt breath on my neck, cold as a morgue freezer. It carried the scent of gasoline and burned flesh, the same smells that had filled my nostrils as I'd crawled away from the wreck, leaving Sarah trapped in the passenger seat. "You should have checked if I was still breathing," Sarah's voice whispered, but it wasn't quite Sarah's voice anymore. It had an echo to it, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well filled with metal scraps. "You should have tried to help me. Instead, you ran. You always run, Laura." I wanted to turn around. Part of me needed to see what was standing there in the darkness, breathing that cold breath on my neck. But I remembered the rules. Looking back was never allowed. Looking back meant facing what you'd done, what you'd left behind. The backup generator finally kicked in with a roar that sounded too much like human screaming. Light flooded back into the store, harsh and unforgiving. I was alone again, but the linoleum floor behind me was marked with wet footprints that smelled of gasoline and antifreeze. The printer had reset itself, its display now showing the correct time, 2:18 a.m. But taped to its side was a Polaroid I knew I'd burned years ago, the last photo of Sarah and me, taken hours before the crash. As I watched, her face in the photo turned toward mine and smiled, her teeth too sharp, her eyes reflecting printer display numbers that shouldn't exist. The rules had become my religion by the end of the week. Each night before leaving, I'd place an unopened bottle of water on the counter, third tile from the register, label facing the door. The fluorescent lights would catch in the liquid, creating rippling patterns across the grimy linoleum floor that never quite matched the movements of the water inside. That night felt different from the moment I stepped into the store. The air hung unnaturally still, like the pause between heartbeats. Even the constant hum of the refrigerators seemed muted, as if something was absorbing all sound before it could fully form. The aisles stretched longer than usual, their ends fading into shadows that shouldn't exist under fluorescent lighting. I'd gotten the routine down to a science: count the drawer, log the sales, set the alarm, place the water. Simple steps that kept whatever lurked in the printer's realm at bay. The bottle had to be new, unopened, the seal unbroken. I'd learned that lesson the hard way 2 nights ago when I'd tried to leave a bottle I'd taken just one sip from. The security footage showed nothing. But I'd found it the next morning. The plastic twisted and melted. The water inside turned to something thick and dark that smelled of rust and regret. Tonight's offering was perfect. Crystal clear water, untouched, pristine. I placed it in its spot with the precision of a religious ritual. The label faced exactly 47 degrees east. Another detail I'd learned mattered, though I couldn't say how I knew. When the angle was wrong, the shadows behind the counter grew teeth. As I gathered my things to leave, movement caught my eye. The bottle had shifted, just slightly, maybe an inch to the left. I blinked, and it was back in its original position. My heart pounded against my ribs as I remembered all the other bottles I'd left, each one gone by morning shift. I never asked Greg what happened to them. Some questions are better left unasked, especially when the answers might come in the form of receipt paper marked with impossible numbers. But tonight, something made me stay. I pretended to count the register again, my trembling fingers moving through the motions while my eyes watched the bottle from the corner of my vision. The station lights flickered, once, twice, and in that split second of darkness, I saw it. A hand emerged from between the shadows cast by the fluorescent lights. It was long, pale, with too many joints in the fingers, moving with a liquid grace that suggested bones were optional. The fingers wrapped around the bottle like pale spiders, and where they touched, the plastic began to ripple as if it were melting. The water inside started to boil, but not from heat. It writhed like something alive, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. Faces I recognized from accident reports and newspaper clippings I'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I ran. It wasn't the first time I'd fled from something I didn't want to see, and muscle memory took over. But as I reached my car, the radio crackled to life without being turned on. Through bursts of static, I heard a voice that sounded like Sarah's, but processed through machinery. "The water is for passage, Laura. Each bottle buys another night of running. But you can't run forever. Even receipt paper has an end." The next morning, Greg mentioned how the night shift replacement had quit suddenly. Left a note about personal reasons. His eyes wouldn't meet mine as he said it, and I noticed his hands shook slightly as he sorted through the morning's receipts. I didn't ask about the bottle, just like I didn't ask about the small puddle of water by the register that seemed to follow my movements in the mirror, or why it smelled faintly of gasoline and tears. When I left that morning, I checked my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the back seat, a figure made of receipt paper and water, its edges blurring like ink in rain. But when I looked again, there was only a small puddle on the seat and a receipt that read, "The next bottle won't be enough. Some debts require more than water to clean." It was inevitable, really. People like me, we don't get clean getaways. Every shortcut comes with a cost. Every escape leaves a trail. The printer knew this from the start, had been patiently collecting my debts like an accountant from hell. The receipt it spat out at 2 a.m. was different from the others. Most receipt paper feels thin, cheap, disposable. This felt like skin beneath my fingers, warm and slightly damp. The text appeared slowly, bleeding up from beneath the surface like bruises rising on flesh. "You thought you could outrun it, Laura? Like you outran what happened to Sarah?" My hands trembled, sending ripples through the paper. Sarah. Even thinking her name made my chest tight with a guilt I'd spent 3 years drowning in alcohol and stolen money. The accident hadn't been my fault. At least, that's what I'd repeated to myself in countless motel rooms and late-night drives. We were both drunk, both stupid. I was just the one who walked away. The printer's hum deepened, its mechanical rhythm taking on an almost mocking tone. Another receipt emerged, this one smelling faintly of the perfume Sarah had been wearing that night, You take and take, Laura, from the registers, from the people who trust you, from Sarah who trusted you to drive that night. Remember what you took from her? Images flashed through my mind, snapshots I'd tried so hard to bury. Sarah laughing as we left the bar, her golden hair catching the neon lights. The argument about who should drive. Me, insisting I was fine, always so sure of myself. The rain on the windshield, the curve in the road, the guardrail giving way like paper. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in rhythm with the printer's hum, casting strange shadows that seemed to reach for me with accusing fingers. Each flicker revealed a different scene from that night, like a horrific slideshow. Flicker. Sarah's face as we started to spin flicker. The tree rushing toward us flicker. Steam rising from the crumpled hood flicker. Sarah, so still in the passenger seat, flicker. Me, crawling away, not looking back. The printer screamed. There's no other word for it. The sound started as a normal mechanical whir, but rose to something between static and a human shriek. Receipt paper poured out in a constant stream, each piece bearing a different accusation. You didn't check her pulse. You didn't call 911. You ran while she burned. You took her future. You took her last breath. You took her chance to say goodbye. The paper kept coming, forming a pile at my feet that rose like ocean waves. Each sheet bore witness to my crimes, not just against Sarah, but every theft, every lie, every person I'd betrayed in my endless running. The printer had been keeping track of all of it. But now, the next receipt read, its letters glowing like embers. It's time to give something back. The air in the store grew thick with the smell of gasoline and burning plastic. In the security monitor's reflection, I saw Sarah standing behind me. Not the Sarah from before the accident. This Sarah was different. Her skin had the texture of thermal paper. Her hair moved like smoke. And her eyes were registration marks, perfectly aligned crosses that held the answer to everything I'd been running from. "The printer knows what you owe," she said, her voice coming from the machine rather than her mouth. "It's been calculating the interest for 3 years. Would you like to see your final balance?" I didn't want to look, but like every other rule I'd broken in my life, I couldn't help myself. The last receipt was already printing, and this one would show exactly what it would cost to settle my account. The real question was, would I finally stop running long enough to pay it?